Thank you all so much for coming tonight and giving me the opportunity to share some of the wonderful experiences that I've had over my last 12 years at Dana-Farber. Now, I am a diagnostic radiologist. I'm not an oncologist, but I've had the opportunity to see many of the wonderful advances that have come to play in the last 15 years. And it's been really an extraordinary experience. I want to share some of that with you tonight. I'm going to start off with a little bit about cancer, relevant to the movie today, under the assumption that none of you have heard anything about it. Now, there are people here who have taught me about cancer, and they know a lot more than I do about it, but still, I'm going to start there. We're going to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and what I think is the future of cancer care. Hopefully this will give a little more perspective to the film that we're about to see. So starting off from the beginning, what is cancer and what does cancer form? Well, cancer is basically when our cells, which are very tightly regulated, lose control. In a normal cell, there are a lot of very carefully coupled signals that say, you are not allowed to divide, you can't make more cells unless certain things happen in your environment, and then you can. And the figure on the right-hand side shows just the cell cycle controls that are present in a normal cell. And we can see over here, a normal cell starts off and says, okay, I've gotten the signal that I need to divide, I need to grow, there's a cut, I need to heal it, and it begins its curve around the cell cycle and copies all of its DNA. And then it goes through the process of organizing those copied DNA back into chromosomes, lines them up, and finally divides, and now you have two cells that have gone through cell cycle regulation. If anything goes wrong in this process in a normal cell, the cell says, okay, well, that wasn't the right thing, and the cell turns itself off and basically falls apart, and the body cleans up and tries again. In cancers, something happens where the cell loses control and it starts to hit the accelerator. And if it's able to break through all of these controls and divide in an uncontrolled fashion, then it becomes a neoplasm. If it learns some additional skills like spreading to other tissues or invading the things around it, then it becomes what we call a cancer. Now, the body is really amazing in its intricacy and in all of the checks and balances that are present. For a cell that has lost control to really become a cancer, it has to learn a lot of things. It has to become self-sufficient in growth signals. That can mean that it's basically telling itself to grow. For example, in lung cancer, there's a little receptor on the surface that normally only gets the message to grow when a particular signal comes. But in cancer cells, sometimes that receptor just says all the time, hey, keep growing, this is great. And that is a trigger for a cancer growth. A cancer also has to lose sensitivity to anti-growth signals. The cells around it and other cells in the body will say, hey, this is not the time, stop growing. And a cancer cell has to lose the sensitivity to that. It has to learn the ability to invade into surrounding tissues or to spread to other parts of the body. It has to have limitless replicative potential, meaning it can keep dividing and dividing without turning off. It has to be able to build its own blood supply. And finally, it has to do something called evading apoptosis, which is basically being able to avoid the body's immune system and all the cellular signals that the body provides that says, hey, you're off track and you need to stop. This is what forms a cancer. Well, in the early days, before the 1940s, we had essentially nothing we could do for this other than trying to surgically remove a tumor. And that was not very effective. And the world wars came around, some horrible things happened, including the use of mustard gas in the world wars. And there was an incident that happened in Italy in which a bombing led to a bunch of people being exposed to nitrogen mustards. And the people who came in to provide care for them found out that their immune cells weren't working very well anymore. And a very smart gentleman named Sidney Farber of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute subsequently said, perhaps we can use this to try to help kids whose immune cells are now cancerous. They have leukemia, their cells are dividing uncontrolled, these children will die if we do nothing. We're going to try and see if this works. And in one of the earliest New England Journal articles I've ever been able to cite, this paper in 1948 showed the first cancer treatment ever. And there's a lot going on here, but this dark line here is the one to focus on. This is the count of the blasts. These are the bad early progenitor cells that should not be present circulating in the blood in this particular child. And this line right here is when they gave aminopterin, which is a derivative of the mustard gas, the chemical weapon that was used in the wars. And as you can see, right after this was given, those bad cells fell way back down. Now they rebounded a few months later, and they tried another trial of mustard gas, aminopterin, and it dropped again, but then it recurred. This was the first sign that maybe we could do something to treat a cancer that was effective, and it happened here. Now, the subsequent basically 50 years was the generation of cytotoxic chemotherapy. And what that means is chemotherapy that was designed to kill the cells. And almost all of these treatments, not exclusively all, but almost all of these treatments were designed to target cells that were dividing rapidly, because that is the hallmark of cancer. And I'm not going to go through all of these therapies, but the basic idea here is that we have things like taxanes and fluorouracil. They all interfere with the mechanisms of the cell cycle. They get integrated into DNA that's being copied and make the DNA fall apart, or they block part of the structure that helps to scaffold the DNA as it's being separated and replicated. And all of these things kill cells that are dividing. That's very effective in cancers that are dividing quickly, but it's also really bad for things like your gastrointestinal tract that has a lot of cells that need to divide regularly, or your hair follicles, or your skin. And it caused a lot of complications. It wasn't specific to the cancer. And so these toxicities were limiting. But this was a remarkable era and led to many new treatments that were effective for many cancers. Now in 2001, around the time that I was getting into medicine, there was a new thing that happened. And rather than just targeting the cell cycle, we had gotten to the point of genetic sequencing where we could actually say, this cancer has this abnormality that is driving its ability to function as a cancer, and now we can make a drug that actually gets into that process, that gets into that gear. And there were several that came around that time, but imatinib was one of the hallmarks of this, and was a really amazing, is a really amazing drug, featured, of course, on the cover of Time here. And this figure shows what happened with a patient who had something called a gastrointestinal stromal tumor. It's a kind of sarcoma. It's a very bad tumor. And this is something called an FDG PET, which basically looks very dark where you have tumor. So this is all tumor in this person's abdomen. And 1 month later, you can see that all of the metabolic activity in this whole tumor has stopped after they gave this drug that interfered with a particular abnormal protein called c-KIT, and it basically shut off the tumor's metabolism. The tumor stopped dividing, stopped being active, and this persisted over quite a long period of time. This was absolutely a revolution, because you could turn off a cancer without having to kill cells all throughout the body. This, again, happened here in Boston. George Dimitri was the lead author on that. The next major revolution happened when I was a practicing radiologist, and this was immunotherapy. Now, when I was an intern, I would see people with metastatic melanoma, and the only treatments at that point in time were basically IL-2, which is essentially the thing that makes you feel terrible when you have influenza, and we would give it in very high doses, and it was just brutal to see. The response rates were not very good. And then immunotherapy came along. And this is an example from another New England Journal article showing this person with advanced metastatic melanoma. These big gray lumps here are tumor deposits all over this person's chest. And this was 12 weeks later. After receiving these immunotherapy regimens, you can see that all of these big gray lumps have basically disappeared. This was amazing. you saw a cancer that was essentially lethal in everyone, and these people were having complete responses where their cancer was disappearing. And it was disappearing for a long time, and for some of these people, it's still gone. Absolutely a revolution that immunotherapy could have such an effect. And basically what this class of drugs did was it allowed your immune system to fight cancer effectively. It turns out that some of these cancer cells were learning that there was a signal that they could give to the immune cells to say, oh, no, I'm actually not a cancer cell. I'm totally fine. You go about your business. And this new drug said, no. You can't use that message anymore. We're taking away your hall pass. And off the immune system went and made a remarkable progress. Now, it turns out this works in a lot of cancers. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think we're going to continue to see progress in this regard. Screening and prevention have also been a really important part of the changes over the last 30 years. So this is a chart of the death rates from 1930 to 2020 for breast cancer. And you can see that for a long time, the breast cancer death rates were basically the same, and then we introduced mammography. Now, in fairness, at the same time, we were also getting taxanes and drugs like that helped. But breast cancer mortality has been on a continuous decline since that period of time, and this is one of the strong arguments for mammography. Now, there are complexities to mammography. I don't want to simplify it, but there has certainly been a dramatic change in breast cancer mortality since it was introduced. Colon cancer. Colon cancer is complicated in that men and women have different rates of colon cancer. We can see the men were a little bit higher here. The women started to decline in the 50s for reasons that are still a little challenging to understand. But colonoscopy was introduced in the late 60s. By around 1985, it had achieved about 35% rate of people getting colonoscopic screenings every 10 years. And by 2010, it was up to 65%. And we see this continuous decline in colon cancer mortality rates. Now, again, at the same time, chemotherapy was introduced that was much more effective for colon cancer, so it's not so simple as just one thing. But these prevention activities these screening activities have really been impactful. Prevention has also been important. These are the death rates from lung cancer. And as we know, smoking became very popular around the time of the Second World War and continued to go up and up and up until the rates started to fall. And this is a chart of the prevalence of smoking in the community. And as we can see, when smoking rates started to go down, the curve for lung cancer also started to fall quickly. Now, lung cancer has benefited from a decrease in smoking, but also a wild increase in the efficacy of the treatments that are used for lung cancer, and people like Bruce Johnson have been instrumental in making that happen. So what has this meant for cancer in the United States and in the world? Well, this is a really beautiful chart because you can see that cancer death rates had been going up for some time in the US, and then around 1990 there was a turn, and they've been in continuous decline since then. This is in part because of screening and prevention, this is in part because of chemotherapy, but we want to see these numbers continue to fall as they have. There's some complexity here. For reasons that we don't understand, young people are suddenly getting colon cancer more, and that's a real puzzle. Pancreatic cancer is becoming more prevalent, and that's very troubling. That's the area that I work on. But for the most part, we're doing better and better with cancer, and the future looks more promising. This has an interesting complexity in that this chart of the number of people who are living with cancer in the US shows that it's going to keep going up and up and up. So from 1975 to now, the number has increased from 3.7 million to 18 million, in part because our population's gotten bigger, but mostly because a lot more people are living with cancer rather than dying from cancer. And I think this number is going to continue to go up. I hope that this becomes an issue of a chronic disease and one of survivorship rather than one of cancer mortality. So hope for the future. The future has a lot that it may offer us, and I do a lot of work in artificial intelligence in cancer and how we may use this to improve future care. So I'm going to talk about two areas that I think are very exciting. One is the possibility of using AI to assist in drug discovery. We've made all of these fantastic discoveries in the last 15 years, and I think that computers are going to help us do even more. This is an example of something called AlphaFold. Now, up until very recently, if you wanted to take a protein, which is coded by a long series of amino acids, which these letters down here represent a long series of amino acids, you had to try to do something called X-ray crystallography, where you would try to make the protein and you would crystallize it and you would shine some X-rays on it and you'd have some smart people look and try to figure out what the structure was, and it took a really long time to do. Well, last year, a group called DeepMind built a program called AlphaFold that tries to predict protein structures from the amino acid sequence. And as it turns out, it does it really, really well. And this is an absolute revolution, because suddenly you can start to take maps of all the proteins that are in cells and in cancers and look at the configuration of these key proteins and start to think about how molecules are going to be targetable for them in a much more efficient way. And I think this is going to accelerate drug discovery, and particularly for cancer, where we have a lot of individualized variations that are present in the cancers. The other thing that I'm very excited about is screening using artificial intelligence and trying to identify people who are at risk before they know it's a problem. And this is kind of the needle in the haystack problem. So my group has done work in something called opportunistic screening, where we take things like CT scans that are performed because you had some belly pain, you went into the ER, you had a little car accident, and we try to extract information from those. This one is automatically finding the pancreas, and we can do some measurements of the pancreas. The one on the right is measuring muscle and fat, which turned to be very important in understanding cancer. And we can generate huge sets of features from these that we can use to try to differentiate people who are going about their normal business and are fine from those who have something simmering, something brewing. This year there were 2 papers that came out that's showing that this kind of analysis can detect pancreatic cancer at least 3 months and potentially 36 months before the diagnosis. Now, there's a lot of work to be done there before it's ready to go out into the clinic, but it's one of the first remarkable signs that maybe we can actually find these things early. Now, it turns out we can also do this with the medical record. We can look at your patterns of medication and your office visits and the codes that they put in, and we can also use that to try to identify people who are showing signs of early pancreatic cancer. I think all of this is going to come together in the next 3 to 5 years, and we're going to start to have systems that can look at what has been going on with us and find the subtlest clues that something is off and raise the red flag so that we can get cured before it's a big problem. So in conclusion, prevention, early detection, novel treatments have made an enormous impact on cancer survival. Expect new and increasingly personalized treatment regimens. And I think that AI is likely to affect many aspects of cancer care, from drug design to early detection and finally treatment selection. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today.